All right. I just want to confirm you all can see the screen. Is that correct? My slide, there's a picture of the
Mm.
copy of the cover of my book and then a photo behind it. Is
It's
that what
looking
y'all are
good,
seeing?
as
Wonderful.
much as the
Okay.
road looks good.
Yeah. So this is the cover of the book I wrote, When Driving is Not an Option, Steering Away from Car Dependency. And it's actually got this lovely illustration on it of some people waiting for the bus. And the bus is arriving. It was done by a friend of mine who's also a low vision non-driver. And then the background image is of me walking along a road, and this is actually in Florida, near Orlando, where Disney World is. And I was there for a work conference, and I needed to get out and get something to eat. And I decided to try to walk to a nearby restaurant, and ended up on this highway. It was really the only way to get there, and there was no sidewalk, just this big shoulder, and it felt, a bit like a being on a freeway. There was high speed traffic coming by, and so you see my shadow here sort of silhouetted. And so one thing I'm going to do during this presentation, and this may be something unfamiliar or newer to you all, is try to visually describe the images that I have on my screen, both as a way of sort of letting you know why I'm showing them, what's important to notice, but also as a form of accessibility so that you have a sense, if say you were calling in, you weren't able to look at your screen, or you were blind or low vision, you would still know what I was talking about, and still have that critical information. So this next image is of the road I grew up on in Washington State. And so I mentioned I'm low vision. I was born with an eye condition called nystagmus, which makes my eyes shake, just a little bit of a quiver all the time when I'm awake. And that means that I have a hard time seeing far distances, seeing details, seeing fast moving objects. And so when I went to try to pass the driver's test when I was 15, I failed. I couldn't see enough to do that. And so then I really struggled because I was living out in the woods with my folks on a road, this road that has no sidewalks, no shoulders, no transit, a couple miles into town. And I hated having to ask my folks for rides places, especially on dates and going out to hang out with my friends. And I felt really trapped. And I really dreamed of living somewhere with better transit access. And so I moved to New York City, and I lived in New York City for around 15 years. And then after I had a kid, I decided I wanted to move back to Washington State. And I also, at that point, started working for the disability community. But before, when I was growing up in Washington, I really struggled because I thought I was the only person who couldn't drive. I thought I was the only, person who was over the age of 16 who didn't have a driver's license, because that's what I saw around me. And so I want to just start by this conversation by asking you all a question. And I know that the context of the UK and the US are different, and we have, different geographies, different land use. But I want you to think about, if you do drive, if you do own a car, who you might know in your own life who doesn't drive or own a car. Whether that's because they're children, whether maybe they're too old to drive, maybe they have a disability, maybe driving a car is expensive, too expensive, or maybe they just live somewhere where driving isn't as necessary, where there is really good transit. And this image on the screen is some folks waiting for a bus stop outside of Austin, Texas. So you can go ahead and share in the chat if you'd like, who you know in your own life, whether that's you or someone else who doesn't drive or can't drive to get around. So I think, there's this assumption, right, in the US that everyone drives. Like, we are a country where everyone drives. And I want to, take this moment to talk to you all about how that isn't true, and that there are many people who would benefit from communities where driving isn't as necessary. So I mentioned that I had a kid, and I was living in New York. I had a kid. I decided I wanted to move back to Washington State to be closer to family and to have that support. And I started working for a nonprofit called Disability Rights Washington. And this is really where the idea for the book came from. We started to interview non-drivers from all over our state. And this is a image of the state of Washington with some little marks on it of where we did interviews. We really tried to make sure we were interviewing folks, not just from our big cities, but also our rural communities and our tribal communities. There's a lot of parts of Washington state that, are big plains, there's desert, there's the mountains, there's all kinds of geographies and all kinds of densities. And we wanted to make sure that all those stories were included. and that we weren't limiting ourselves when we asked people to share their transportation experiences with us, that we weren't limiting it to people who, didn't have, who identified as disabled. We wanted to make sure to be able to also include people who couldn't drive for other reasons. And there's an image here on the right of my colleague Abby and I doing some outreach where we were at a fair for recent immigrants, a farmer's market and a sort of an outreach fair where we were talking to folks who had immigrated to the US and were refugees from Afghanistan and Iraq. And many of those families also didn't have cars. And so we wanted to show the overlap between the needs of people who, couldn't drive because of a disability, but also people who couldn't drive for other reasons, and show that we had much in common, much more in common than we perhaps realize. And that's sort of where this idea of non-drivers comes from, that we are all of us who can't drive, choose not to drive, can't afford to drive, we are all non-drivers in some way. And so there's an image here of some different sort of categories of non-drivers, but recognizing that a lot of these categories overlap or intersect, that people can be in multiple categories at once. And so the first big category of non-drivers that I talk about in my book are people who can't drive because of a disability. So, people like myself who are low vision or blind, people in wheelchairs. There's an image here of Erica who uses a power wheelchair. And she could drive if she could afford a vehicle that could accommodate her power wheelchair, but those are really expensive, and that's not something she can afford on her income. And so she uses transit to get around. And so recognizing that, sometimes not being able to drive is, maybe partially because of a disability, but also, because of the cost. And those things often overlap. And this picture in the middle is of folks riding the bus in my neighborhood in Seattle during the pandemic. And, in some areas we saw big fall-offs in who was riding public transit during the pandemic. But in communities where people didn't have other options, in low-income communities and communities of color, and immigrant communities, that transit ridership really retained high numbers. And that was because people were non-drivers, that transit was essential to how they were able to get around. There's a picture here on the bottom left of my grandma. A lot of people age out of driving and age out of driving safely. And that can be very hard when you live in communities where, like rural communities or other communities where there aren't transit options. And my grandma really struggled with this. She lived in a farming community, and when she started having a heart condition and she would pass out unexpectedly, she kept driving anyway, because she didn't want to have to move away from the farm and the community that she loved. And then finally, the last big category of non-drivers that I talk about in the book are young people. And this is, people who are choosing not to get driver's licenses because it's expensive or stressful, or they have climate concerns. Young people in the US are much less likely now as 16-year-olds to get driver's licenses than they were before, when I was a teenager in the 90s. And then people who are too young to drive, children, right, are also part of this coalition or this group of non-drivers. And there's an image here of my kid and another kid waiting for the bus. And a lot of people don't want to count children as part of this group. They think they're separate or different and have different needs. But the reality is that the needs of children who can't drive are very similar to the needs of other non-drivers. We all need, safe ways to get places and reliable ways to get places that, we can do without being behind the wheel of a private car or truck. So altogether, non-drivers make up about 30% of the population of the US. And I think this is shocking to people who come to this work, sort of assuming that everyone who needs to get somewhere in our country can get there by driving themselves, when the reality is about 30% of the population can't. And, this is more evident when you start to notice it and you start to think about it. Perhaps you are, watching people wait for a bus in an area where the bus doesn't run very frequently, or you notice, that there are paths worn in the side of the edge of the road where there's no sidewalk, but there's grass. There's an image here of, this is in Huntington, California, where the plants have all been worn away on the side of the road because people are walking where there's no sidewalk. And so I like to highlight this number in the work that I do because I think it's important for people to really recognize that our communities that are built around just getting where you need to go in a car really don't serve us well, and aren't serving so many of us well. And we could really benefit from rethinking both our land use and our transportation systems in a way where driving isn't essential. So I want to pivot to speaking a bit about how non-drivers and in particular disabled non-drivers get around in the US, and why some of the things that we can start to do to address some of the gaps and barriers. So the first sort of the most primary way folks who can't drive get around is asking other people for rides. And this is because our country is so car dependent. In most of our country, there isn't good, reliable transit. Transit can take, if it does exist, even in Seattle where I live, next to really frequent and good transit, to get most places in the city of Seattle is about a 15 to 20-minute drive. If you could drive, you could get anywhere in that time. If you were taking the bus, it's probably closer to 2 hours. There's just these huge disparities in how much time people will take to get places because our transit isn't great. So if you have a social network, you can rely on friends and family. Most non-drivers feel that that's the easiest way to get around. But that comes with a cost. And there's a quote here from Jaime Torres and an image of Jaime, who says, "It is beyond frustrating having to depend on others for transportation. It really affects me to the point where it's easier to just isolate myself in my room so I don't feel like a burden." And I think that feeling like a burden is something that we hear all the time when we talk to non-drivers about what it's like to have to ask for rides. So thinking about in your own life, and again, you're welcome to share this in the chat if you'd like to, but when was the last time you had to ask someone for a ride somewhere? What did that feel like? Did you feel like you owed them something? Just reflecting on that experience. Another option for non-drivers is paying for rides. This, of course, is really tricky, though, because ride hail like Uber and Lyft, those services are expensive, especially because many non-drivers are low income. They're not something that people can rely on, on a daily basis to get where they need to go. There's also the issue of wheelchair accessibility. Many of Lyft and Uber are not wheelchair accessible in the US. And in most places, except for New York City, really, there's not very many wheelchair accessible cabs. And there's an image here of Amandeep, who is a white cane user. She's blind. And she says, "In the blind community, not all blind people have good jobs. Students and others are struggling financially, and Uber is expensive." So, paying for rides might be available to some non-drivers in some situations, but it's not really a systemic way to have access. So thinking about in your own community, where you live, are Uber and Lyft available? In many parts, rural, they're just not. How much do they cost? How has that cost changed? And is there a wheelchair accessible option of vehicles for hire? Is that available? So if you feel like sharing that in the chat, you can go ahead. I think, much of our trouble and the root of much of what is difficult about transportation access in the United States is our land use policy. Because we have built things around car access, the destinations we need to get to are really far apart. And then we have to make sure we have all the vehicle storage. We need to park vehicles when you get there. And so you end up, with sprawl, with communities where also, the dense areas, the walkable areas, the areas perhaps that have transit service are increasingly expensive and sought after as people want to live in walkable communities. And then, people who can't afford that are priced further and further out. And there's a quote here from Vaughn who says, "More affordability means moving further out. Moving further out means more limited transportation." And this is such a challenge if you can't afford to drive or you can't drive. And then the only affordable housing is way out on the outskirts or in a rural area. You really become trapped in this cycle of not being able to get places, not being able to get to a job because that transportation access and the land use decisions that we've made. So how do we begin to change these things? Transit, right, is one wonderful solution, and I am such a huge fan and such a user of public transit. There's an image here of Abby Griffith, who's a blind non-driver from Washington State, who really describes, what it was like for her to move from a rural area with no transit into a city where she could take the bus to the grocery store, and just the joy she felt in having that freedom of access. And it's something I felt when I moved to New York City and suddenly had access to a 24-hour subway system. Like, that was just mind-blowing. Of course, transit, it exists in our cities. It's variously underfunded. It's struggling a lot coming out of the pandemic because a lot of the commuter ridership went away. So thinking about in your own community, does transit exist? Where does it go? When does it stop running? And if how much does it cost? Because that's something also for low-income folks on fixed income. The cost of transit can be a barrier as well as the lack of coverage. One piece that I think we often forget in this is that sidewalks are part of the transit network. I'm just going to read that because that is the way I want to frame it. In the US, we have very different systems of governance around who manages our right-of-way, our roads and sidewalks, and who manages our transit systems. But they need to be thought of as a single system. If you can't get to your transit stop because the sidewalk doesn't exist or it's inaccessible, then that transit system becomes inaccessible as well. And so for folks who can't use transit, then they are either stuck at home or having to rely on our paratransit systems, which mean you have to call a day or two in advance and request a ride, and then it takes a couple of hours. Often not the most efficient or most flexible way of getting places. So there's some images here. There's an image of Tanisha, who's a power wheelchair user, and she talks about having to roll in the street. And this image is of her on the street from her house to the bus stop, where there are no curb ramps for her wheelchair to get up. And also the sidewalk is super cracked and has all this loose gravel that would flip her chair. And so she instead has to ride in the street. And I was there with her as we did this, and we were taking photos and filming, and it was so scary. And cars were yelling at us, and she's been, doored like a cyclist in her wheelchair because she was in the street, because our sidewalk networks are so incomplete and also inaccessible. And then there's some additional images here. There's some image of JR and Kat who live in a more rural area, and they're waiting for the bus at a bus stop. But the bus stop, it's on this rural road with no shoulder, no sidewalk, and the bus stop is loose gravel. And so Kat's in a wheelchair, and if she was to pull into that loose gravel, she would get stuck or she would flip. And so she has to wait on this rural road in traffic. And of course, we were standing there waiting for the bus, and cars are going by at I'm not gonna be able to do this in kilometers, but 50 miles an hour. And it was, it was terrifying to be there in the middle of the road and not have a safe place to wait for the bus. The bottom images of Chris, who lives in the Vancouver, Washington area, and she's also trying to go from her house to the bus stop, and it's this muddy path, and she uses a white cane to navigate, and so it's just much trickier to do when you don't have like the hard edge of the edge of a sidewalk to sort of guide your path by. I apologize. There are some airplanes going by. Hopefully that's not too loud for you all. So thinking about your own community, where are there missing sidewalks or unsafe crossings? Because, crossing also a major issue, right? If you can't get to the bus stop because the road you have to cross, there's no place to cross there, or there's no safe way to cross, is a huge barrier. So in Seattle, we've been working on this issue. In most of the U.S., not every community, but most of the U.S. sidewalks are the responsibility of individual property owners, adjacent property owners, to maintain. So while the city government will fix the potholes in the street, if the sidewalk gets cracked, that's left up to the property owner. And in most places, there's very little enforcement of that, and so sidewalks just remain super cracked and bumpy. And so we have been, fighting to change that, fighting to get more public maintenance of sidewalks. We haven't gotten to the place where we've changed who's legally responsible, but we have been able to fund programs that have the city go in and do a lot of the repairs, even though the property owner is still the person who's supposed to be doing it. We know that's not going to happen. And there's some images here of us at City Hall with a group of folks with a walkable city sign, and then a story from our local newspaper where we got sidewalks to be the real transportation levy that we have on the ballot this November that will fund, hopefully, more sidewalk construction and more sidewalk repair. Another piece that gives me hope in the solution for transportation access for non-drivers is the expansion of e-mobility, and e-mobility designed for us, designed for non-drivers, people who can't afford a car or can't drive a car. I'm someone, even as a low vision person, I can bike for transportation as long as I don't go too fast. And as a parent, now that I have a cargo e-bike, it has radically expanded my mobility access in a city where, because the bus is so much slower than driving, the bike can often provide a way to get places that's a little bit quicker and more reliable. Less waiting around. And so there's a couple images here. One is of me and my friend Rachel, who's also a low vision mom, with our kids on the back of our e-bikes, riding on a very lovely trail. I wish more of our streets looked like that. That is not. That's a nice rail trail. But a lot of these advances in the new e-bikes, new cargo bikes, new cheaper batteries. I was just hearing about a foldable e-bike available at Walmart for $450, which is just like, that is a stunning amount of access available to folks now for a really low price point. Unfortunately, a lot of those innovations and cheaper, better tech isn't translating as fast as it could be into the power wheelchair space. Because in the US, those are all paid for through healthcare. And so it's like a insurance reimbursement thing if you need a power wheelchair. They're too expensive for most people to be able to purchase on their own. And so there hasn't been that same level of innovation. And so we don't have as long-lasting batteries. A lot of the wheelchairs aren't able to be used in the rain. So if you're someone who lives in Seattle, you've got to, my friends will wrap the hand controls in plastic bags to be able to get somewhere when it's drizzling. And that just, it doesn't have to be that way. This isn't rocket science. We could be innovating with power chair battery tech and waterproofing in the same way we do with e-bikes. There's a quote here from Ian Mackey, who's a power chair user in Washington State, who also organizes these awesome long distance, usually on trails, but events for people who are wheelchair users, where he brings in a lot of electric chairs and power chair pieces for people to borrow to try out that technology to see if it's something they would like in their lives. And he says, oftentimes people's lifestyles are shaped by the equipment that they have. A family should be able to go spend the day at Disneyland and not run out of batteries. And that is, the fact that you couldn't do that, you can't do that with many of the battery capacity in power chairs is just unfortunate and frustrating. So at the end of the day, I'm gonna share these recommendations with you. I've shared a few things that give me hope, but I think a lot of it comes to down to our ability to bring in other voices into spaces where we're not hearing those voices currently, so that we have some of the expertise of disabled non-drivers and other kinds of non-drivers in rooms where decisions get made, so that we can design better and more inclusive systems. And so there's a quote here from Dr. Beverly Scott that I'm going to try to read here if I can get my there we go, my thing to move. She says, "It is not a matter of altruism. It is not a matter of, oh, I'll make 2 tables here and you get to be at the little table and we're going to be at the big table. This is a matter of responsibility on the part of those who are being good leaders and stewards." So really the importance of bringing in those voices of communities that haven't been represented historically into decision-making rooms is what's going to change this work. And this image on the left is Abby, who you saw earlier. She is leading a walk-roll audit with some transportation officials from our state Department of Transportation, showing them how it feels like for her and another someone in a wheelchair to cross some of the intersections that they're designing. So I encourage you, the walk roll audit really is a powerful tool. And so if you haven't in your own advocacy or in your own work in the transportation space, organize one of these. I think they're great. It's also important to get decision makers to go out and experience transportation outside of the way they normally do. And so this here is a quote from, let's see. One second as I move my windows again. A quote from Ivanova, who is a non-driver from Washington State. And she says, "Legislators don't understand the pain and agony of standing in the rain at a bus stop or having to be stuck at a crosswalk and missing your bus. Can you imagine waiting in the rain another hour waiting for the next bus?" And there's an image here of some folks waiting for the next bus in the rain, which happens a lot here, and in the UK as well, I presume. So then there's an image here of another walk audit with a bunch of power chair users where we were trying to navigate some rail tracks and a bunch of missing curb ramps and an electric e-bike, one of the shared bike share bikes that was parked blocking a sidewalk. So, getting out here and really experiencing what it's like to see how someone else moves in a community and what that experience is like is so key. Which is why we started the Week Without Driving Challenge. And we launched this challenge in 2021 at the organization I work for at Disability Rights Washington. And the idea is that we want elected leaders and other officials, other community leaders in our areas to experience that travel as a non-driver. And ideally to experience it as a non-driver who has disabilities or has other barriers to accessing their community. And so we launched it in 2021. The idea is that you go for a full week without driving. This is a radical idea in most of the US and something that many people struggle with and say they cannot do. And so if they can't do the full week, we say that's okay. We just ask you to think about when you do drive somewhere that week, what would someone who didn't have the option of driving do in that situation? Would they not take their kid to that activity? Would they skip that doctor's appointment? Would they not go meet their friends for a drink? To really, contemplate, because there are so many non-drivers in our communities, to really contemplate that what it is like for them to experience transportation. There's an image here on the screen now of Crystal Monteros, who's a wheelchair user. During Week Without Driving, she was hosting a conversation with some of her elected officials, explaining to them that, she lives somewhere where there's no sidewalk to the bus stop. And so when it's muddy, she has to get a friend to push her through the mud once she gets off the bus, or she's stuck there. So she, has to wave at someone across the street in her apartment complex to go get her. And so we've been working with her for a number of years now to try to find the funding to get this piece of missing sidewalk constructed. So yeah, I encourage you, if you haven't had a chance, to check out weekwithoutdriving.org this year. So it started in 2021. It grew to a national challenge in the last 2 years. And we just wrapped up the 4th Week Without Driving challenge, September 30th through October 6th. And we're in the process of collecting stories and collecting statistics from people who participated. But I know we did have participation from organizations co-hosting it in all 50 states, which was pretty exciting. Some of our states are, pretty rural, and this is a big ask. And then we also had a little bit of international participation. I think we had some folks in Canada and Australia supporting us as well and hosting the challenge. So this just sort of outlines the challenge itself. The idea is that, right, you don't drive for the full week. You can ask for rides, you can pay for rides, you can ride transit, you can walk places, you can try to reschedule things or do remote appointments. And then to really reflect on, who has the privilege of getting where they need to go in our communities. And if you are able to afford to live somewhere, your life, is living somewhere where you have great transit access and everything is super close by. Recognizing that is not the experience of so many people in our communities who can't afford that and are priced, super far out. So I do want to open it up for questions now. Again, this is the cover of the book and the lovely drawing by Amara of some non-drivers waiting for the bus. So I'm gonna close this screen share and take some questions. And I guess one thing to think about when you're thinking about your questions is if you were to experience the Week Without Driving yourself, like say next week, you were to try to go, if you are someone who drives, what would your experience be like? What barriers would you encounter? Are there trips you would have to rethink? Or would it be easy? And what does that say about, the decisions that your community has made around investments for transportation access for non-drivers? So let's see, and then I'm happy to take some other questions from you all. And I haven't had a chance to look at the chat now, so I'm gonna poke through it right now and look at some of the things that you shared while we get those queued up.
Can I ask a question? In Britain, a lot of local shops are closing down because of the impact of internet retail. And it's really a second wave of orientation of community facilities, moving away from people and focusing more on either cars or vehicle-based deliveries. Is this the sort of thing that's been discussed in the States? Because generally what happens in the States happens in Europe maybe 10, 20 years later.
Hmm. Yeah, no, I mean, I think local retail has, the pandemic and then, Amazon, right? Like it is much easier often for people to order and cheaper for people to order things online. Or, our grocery stores get consolidated. And so now we've had a lot of inflation. Grocery prices have gone up quite a bit, and more families are, needing or preferring to shop at our big discount grocers like Costco, right? And those tend to be, in big industrial areas that have very little transit and giant parking lots. And you really, it is difficult, if not impossible, to get there without a car. And so then that, puts out of business the smaller local grocery stores. So yeah, I mean, it is something I think about a lot, especially the delivery piece, I guess, because, you know, it is convenient. There aren't any like, drugstore pharmacies in my neighborhood. And so I end up ordering a lot of things from Amazon, things that I should be able to just pick up at a local pharmacy. But it is, there's not one nearby, and so I don't. And then, then it puts other ones out of business. And I think, yeah, for non-drivers, grocery delivery is something that I have heard that some folks use because, getting and hauling groceries can be difficult. Maybe they don't live near a grocery store. But then these grocery delivery services also, come at a premium. They cost extra. And so if you're stretching money, already it can add up. So I do think it's hard because the delivery does provide some access, right, for people who don't have the ability to go to a store, but it then, further sort of undercuts our local ecosystem of shopping. But as does being able to drive to these big, big box like Walmart, Costco sort of stores as well. So I think both those things together. I think one thing that actually gave me hope, and I was thinking about writing about this soon, but I was just in Idaho, which is a super rural state. And I was there for a conference, and I walked to the downtown, and the town I was in is a college town. So there's a lot of university students who don't drive or have cars. And I have never been, I can't remember the last time I was in a small town where all the shops were open and thriving. Usually you go to a small downtown and everything's boarded up. And this was not the case. There was like everything. There was a toy store. I mean, it was just like, I felt like I was in some sort of, I don't know if you have Hallmark there, but like a Hallmark movie of, I couldn't believe that there were these local businesses on this walkable old main street that were open. And I think a lot of it had to do with the fact that we were in a rural state and there was nothing around. So even if kids had cars, there was nowhere to go further out. But also many of the students there didn't have cars. And so this was where they were doing all their shopping, and it created enough of a critical mass of shoppers that this was a thriving community. And it made me sad for so many downtowns I've seen that aren't like that.
Cameron
That was a
Abbey
long response. Yeah.
Cameron Abbey has asked a question about design and planning in the States. Cameron, why don't you put your microphone and camera on and ask the question?
My question was, has urban design and planning moved away from segregated settlements by bypasses in the US, or are people still heavily reliant on car usage?
Yeah, I mean, I think the problem is that land, the most affordable land in the US, right, is the things that are further out. And so, we have such a housing crisis with affordable housing everywhere almost in our communities, where housing prices are far beyond what you can pay for on, a minimum wage or even not a minimum wage job, even like a middle class job. Housing has just become completely unaffordable. And so when there is land that can be developed for more affordable housing, that land is usually, the way to make the math work is that land is further out. And so then you lock people into either having to own a car or having to, get rides from people if they then live in those communities where affordable housing is getting built. So I think that was your question. I mean, I definitely think, there is this sort of, I think there's a lot of, conversation in the US. And I mean, I would say there's two things. One, there's a huge divide politically in our country right now. And there's a narrative that, you know, being anti-car is un-American, right? But I think the way we sort of deconstruct that narrative or challenge that narrative a little bit is by talking about all the people in our communities who can't drive, you know, our seniors who are aged out of driving, our young people, our disabled people, low-income people. And you know, it doesn't become, it can't be political if so many of us can't access this thing, right? Even in rural areas or conservative areas, there are huge percentages of non-drivers. And so, you know, focusing on that piece, I think allows us to diffuse some of the partisanship that happens around the conversation about, you know, reducing car use or reducing car dependency.
Lynn has asked a question about cycling with limited sight. Maybe could we expand that question? I mean, there are a range of different sight conditions. To what extent is the range of impact on everyday life? For example, I had a detached retina about 5 years ago. So for a while, I was operating on one eye only. And it comes as a complete surprise that with one eye, you don't get any perception of depth. So things like steps, you can still get up and down steps, but you just have to be a bit careful. So could you tell us a little bit about some of the other eye conditions, other disabilities, and how that impacts on everyday life and how maybe things could be eased to make life a little bit easier?
Definitely. And you know, I'm not a specialist in this space, but so I can speak a lot about my own condition. And I know, you know, it's interesting because especially when you're born with your sight a certain way, it is almost impossible to imagine what someone else sees, right? Or the way they see, because yeah, I just don't know, right? I think, you know, for me, what I see and what they know about nystagmus is that when your eyes move, your brain only takes images when they're holding still momentarily. So it's almost like a movie camera where my brain is getting distinct images that aren't continuous. And so that's, you know, yeah, so that's sort of how my vision is limited. You know, with cataracts, right, it can be really different. You know, you'll have spots that are just completely sort of blocked out. There's other sorts of vision conditions where your field of vision becomes very small, even though the center of it is still, or where it's good is still normal. You know, it narrows down. And so, you know, I think it is totally individual around biking access and what people feel comfortable or safe with. There are great, you know, tandem biking groups for folks who, you know, don't feel comfortable steering the bike themselves. And that, you know, I know many blind folks who do that and love it. If you are, you know, the one sort of in the front steering it, for me and other low vision folks that I know who bike, I think, you know, we have conditions that we prefer. For me, a lot of like harsh light and shadow makes things more difficult. A lot of that is because of the lack of depth perception, right? And speed, right? So I know that over a certain speed, definitely over 20 miles an hour, starting over 15, my ability to feel really safe and make sure I'm not going to hit, you know, things starts to decrease. And I still, like, you know, I have a hard rule about no mountain biking because you know, I need a smooth surface. I can't see well enough to, like, you know, navigate the correct way over bumps and rocks and roots and not end up hurting myself. But yeah, and I think is, you know, whether it's something that you learn to do as a kid has a huge impact. I know other people with the same condition who, you know, didn't learn to bike as kids, and learning at things as an adult when your brain is a little more less plastic is trickier. So it really is super individual, but I think there's also in the US, there's historically a lot of tension between disability groups and bike groups, and blind groups and bike groups in particular. And that's unfortunate because there is actually a lot of overlap, but not a ton of visibility of that overlap, because many people with low vision who aren't totally blind, I think, don't feel like they have a space in the blind community, but also there's so much stigma around vision loss and choosing to do things with vision loss that, you know, people are very private about biking as low vision people, because you don't want to get, you know, in trouble or, you know, people to freak out about it. And so, yeah, those things are all factors. I would say, you know, one thing that I've been thinking a lot about is with e-bikes. There's a lot of conversations going on in the US about regulation of e-bikes and, you know, at what age should you be allowed to ride an e-bike? Should you need a driver's license? What are the insurance requirements for the different classes of e-bikes, right? Like where should that cutoff be? And I, fully agree that, if you're going 30 miles an hour, that's not safe for me. I know. And maybe that's the point at which, you need a license, you need some insurance. If you're traveling at slow speeds where the risk of causing injury to anybody else is really minimal, I really do think we need to keep it open to people and not have licensing requirements that would exclude people who could do it safely. And insurance is the same thing, right? If you're going to require like vehicle registration and insurance for e-bikes, the insurance companies don't, allow you to do that without a driver's license. And so I wouldn't be able to have an e-bike if insurance was required. So a lot in that space is still getting figured out. And I don't think, we definitely need some regulation, but making sure where that line is drawn allows as many people with disabilities as possible to continue to e-bike safely.
There is this question of what you raise about micro-mobility. I think this week Elon Musk unveiled his autonomous taxi. Is it possible that developments such as that, whilst creating freedom for people who can't drive, may also push society to be even more adapted around car use?
That's it, right? Exactly, right? Because the easier it gets to drive places, the more people are going to do that. And the more car dependent our communities will become. And then to say you can't afford a robotaxi, then you're not going to be able to have any access because things will be, spread out in the way they are now, but perhaps even worse. You think about if right now part of what keeps, commutes from being ridiculous is that people, at a certain level, people are like, okay, I don't want to spend 2 hours driving a day, right? But if you're not the one driving, your ability or your willingness to, commute even further, I think will increase. And so we have to be really careful about how we're inducing more car dependency. That being said, I was super skeptical about whether the autonomous vehicle technology was ever going to work. I think there's so much nuance in driving, especially in urban environments, that I questioned. And I still think there's a lot of pieces they haven't figured out. I did ride a Waymo in Phoenix for the first time a couple of weeks ago, and I took it to the airport, and it was sort of this moment of I went to kind of hate ride it, right? I was like, oh my gosh, I think these are so dangerous for pedestrians. I think they're evil, but I'm gonna ride one because I get all these questions about autonomous vehicles. And I got in, and it's the first time I've ever been in a car by myself, and it was kind of liberating. And I had this moment of, oh my gosh, I don't have to like sit here and make conversation with the driver or perform any way to make sure that the driver, is safe or likes me, or there was none of that sort of negotiation of that space. And that was really nice. And so I would definitely use them if they were available instead of having a ride-hail driver. It was a great experience for me. But I don't think it's a great experience for, if we're talking like holistically as land use and planning for our communities, should that be the solution we're building to? I think absolutely not.
Mr. Peters has posed this question about whether we can agree we are past the age of the car. And at the same time, a lot of politicians try to make political capital about the war on motorists. Mr. Peters, would you like to put your question or point, and perhaps that can provoke a bit of discussion?
Yes, thank you. First of all, Anna, you're preaching to the converted, yeah, and I love to hear all of this, and it resonates so much with what I have been involved as an urban designer, or you call it urbanist, transport mobility consultant more in the German and Irish English context. But with the same problems, maybe not as bad as they are in the US. I lived in New York for a while, and I've traveled the US a bit, so I'm familiar with what you've been describing, and thank you very much for describing it again from that very specific angle of a visually impaired or mobility impaired, which is just pushed by the wayside so much by mainstream transport planning. So big factor. I just remember there was I listed the book by David Engwicht, Reclaiming Our Cities and Towns. Very, I think, very strong messages from the 90s. Then there was a book After the Car. I don't know if you remember that. Also saying we're done with the car. We've moved on so much in our knowledge, and there's a lot that supports that. However, of course, we have a very strong lobby in the US, in Germany as well. I mean, the Germans and their cars is just it's such a taboo. It's almost as bad as telling French people they shouldn't have dogs. It's just it's the holy cow. But I think with understanding what compact design is, what urban universal design is, the qualities of living in the city, I think we're getting there, and we're all from different angles. We're basically pushing cars to the side of the roads or making them feel as guests. I don't know if you have. I've come across that in a couple of Dutch towns where the car is a guest and it's moving like on eggshells or eggs, you know. It's just moving along. You can drive through any town in the Netherlands, but you wouldn't want to, because it's a headache, and you just don't do it anymore. Yeah. Having said that, you need to have the choice to do that and not be dependent on cars. And I think that's where the dilemma is. And I tried to say that earlier. Here in Ireland, we have a lot of car dependency built into mortgages that last decades, of people who just wanted to live that suburban or rural dream. Yeah. And now they're stuck there, and they have to pay off their mortgages, and they need to drive into the next town, 20 kilometers or 15 miles, whatever. Yeah. And they then want to park right outside the pharmacy, right outside the Lidl or the Aldi. And that is a detriment to a quality street. And I think that's where the conundrum is. Yeah. And we're dealing with that. Here in the I say in the Irish context, I think the UK are on a similar trajectory, aren't they?
Yeah, I mean, I can't speak to the UK at all, but I would say, I mean, I think that what we make a mistake when we talk about transportation or transport. I love how you guys use that. I'm going to start trying to say transport. It's separate from land use and housing, because they are the same system. And when we break them apart, we can't actually address those underlying causes of where people can live and where people can afford to live. And, I mean, part of it, right, as you're saying, is that like cultural aspect, like I mean, cars are sold to us all the time. You turn on any TV, like most ads are car ads in the US. You're, told constantly about this idealized car, lifestyle. That's part of it, but it's also, I think, this idealized rural lifestyle. And we have, the whole housing industry, all the home decorating, all the yard, all the garden, like there's then, our home values, right, are based around this sort of, single family home that becomes your retirement vehicle that you invest in for years and years. And then you have financial security when you get old. Like that whole system feeds car dependency. And so it's a lot to try to untangle that without, telling people, okay, you're not going to have economic security. You're not going to be able to get where you need to go. You're not going to be able to afford housing. You're not going to have a retirement, system, because we're getting rid of, this system where all your investments go into, maintaining and building the single family home. Yeah, it's a lot. But I think, realizing that what I want to make sure people understand when I talk to them is that, like, I'm not blaming individuals, or it's not some sort of moral choice for most people about whether to drive or not to drive, or whether to own a car or not own a car. There are people who don't have that choice. And our society is set up to make that choice the choice that people are pushed into, right? And so it's more that we, on a larger systemic level, we need to think about how do we make different land use and policy decisions that allow us to not have such car-dependent communities.
Totally agree. I think that's exactly the bridging between land use and transport planning. Yeah, they're so interlinked. Yeah, And yeah, if you just if you sell land just for the penny, then people move out and you have a transport issue. Yeah, it's
Yeah.
as easy as that.
I'm
Thanks.
just seeing a comment in the chat from Lynn in the small shops as a kid. And I didn't tell this part of my grandma's story, and I think this is a good thing to wrap up with. But so my grandma, who I pictured earlier, who had the heart condition, and she kept driving, but she would, pass out while she was driving and drive off the road. But she lived in a rural area, so she never hurt herself or hurt anyone. And then, finally she passed away, but not in a car crash, so that was good. But she lived in this small rural community. It was a farming community. And there used to be a grocery store and a pharmacy and a hardware store and a school and a gas station, right? All in this little community in the 50s and 60s. And then the US built our highway system, and they actually built a highway right through this town. It took some land from my family's farm. And suddenly, for folks who could drive, it became, it was still 20 miles into the nearest town, but you're now on a highway instead of driving these rural back roads. It was pretty fast to go into the next town over, which was a big town, or the next big town over, and go to the Walmart, right? Or go to the big grocery store. And so all the stores in this small town closed, right? And so then when she couldn't drive anymore, she didn't have an option. She had to keep driving. She still had to drive into that big town to get anything because everything had closed locally, because we had chosen to, invest massively in this highway system, and not really think about what it meant to have local stores remain in a community. All right, maybe one more question.
Anybody? Perhaps one last question. You
Yes.
mentioned this division between different disability groups and cyclists, and we've had this issue about the war on motorists. How do you think it would be possible for people to see each other more as part of the human race, as brother and sister, as part of the same community, rather than somehow at war with one another?
Yeah, and I guess for me, that's why the non-driver frame is helpful, because and why I asked that question at the beginning, because I think it's important for people to think about within their own families, or maybe in their own street or their own church group or, neighborhood, who doesn't drive. And likely there are young people, right? Or people who have aged out of driving, or disabled community members. And so it does sort of depoliticize that question. It doesn't become about just the people who are choosing not to drive and, this partisan issue, right? It really then becomes, okay, we all actually have non-drivers in our communities. And right now, those non-drivers have very limited access because we're not investing in transit, because we're not making sure that we have, connected, smooth sidewalks and places to walk and roll. We're not thinking about land use decisions that could make it easier for people to live independent lives, even children to get to school without being driven by a parent. And so that really is, the frame that I use to think about that.
Well, thank you very much for sharing your time with us, and thank you everybody else. Thank you for your contributions in chat. Cameron, you've practically written a short report in chat, and you've raised loads of interesting questions, which maybe we should discuss at some future meeting. Now, I wish you the very best for the future. Thank you for coming, and look after your mobility. I was told once by Arup, so Arup used to employ a futurologist, and one of his lines was, "We all become disabled," and unfortunately, that's true unless we're permanently disabled fairly early on in our career by being killed, shot, or whatever. But as you get older, things cease to function so well, and it's said that in your later life, the world shrinks, and you spend time living maybe within 1 or 2 miles of where you live. So it's something that we're all going to face, and unfortunately, as a society as a whole, we tend to ignore these things and only address them when we're actually confronted by the problems ourselves personally. and by then it's a bit too late.